Hello lads, ladies, gents, ladetts, whoever, whatever, welcome back to another video. For the better part of the last 100 years, the Looney Tunes have found themselves gracing movies, TVs, and video games. With an incredibly wide range of characters, the franchise has never truly lost any popularity, and it's seen many different iterations and evolutions over the years to help maintain its place in pop culture. Arguably in the late 80s through the 90s, the franchise saw its biggest peak, bringing in new shows like Taz-mania and Tiny Toons, with some of these shows still actually going today, all the while inspiring the Animaniacs. So it's no surprise that these series saw themselves getting tie-in games. However, as you would probably expect, most of these, since they were in the 90s, ended up being platformers. Not that all of them would be, but it was pretty typical of the time. In saying that, since there's only so much you can really say about platformers, well, I thought I'd cover a few different games today, and one of them actually isn't a platformer in Tas-mania. We do have the traditional platformer in Tiny Toons, and something just a little bit different in Animaniacs. Starting out with Tiny Toons Adventures Buster Busts Loose, we see ourselves playing as the titular character Buster Bunny. Now, you might think of him to be nothing more than a Bugs Bunny placeholder, and although I do feel like there is something to be said about that in a capacity, he's definitely his own bunny. Never thought I would be saying that sentence in my life. Getting back on track, the game sees Buster traversing his way through several themed levels. There isn't really much to be said in the way of an overall plot here, as each level is sort of its own unique thing that might be referencing something else. Effectively, the game is trying to replicate the show here by having things be episodic, which I would consider to be a major strength. What really helps sell this is the fact that at the beginning of each level we're shown a film reel with a conversation happening between a couple of characters, setting up the level ahead. We'll get a little bit of the backstory, a little bit of what to expect, and maybe some hints and tricks along the way. These really help flesh out the characters, especially when they're having a conversation, because otherwise, as it's a platformer, there's only so much you could do. These rudimentary cutscenes were just what they had to work with, and I do appreciate them for what they are. They have a nice bit of charm to them. Another massive strength of the game is both its music and graphics. The graphics are full of bright colors and are extremely pleasing to the eye, thanks to its wonderful sprite work. There is some great animation throughout, and you really can't fault much when it comes to the overall visual presentation. The music also really helps solidify this. It has a wonderful energy and is super bouncy. It's what you would expect for the game you're playing. Yes, it is targeted towards kids, so it's not exactly the most complex music you're ever going to hear, but I do think it services the game perfectly. There's also a nice variety of mini-games throughout to help break up the platforming gameplay, which is a massive service of the game in terms of its replayability, as the game itself is pretty damn short. If you know what you're doing, odds are you'll beat the game in anywhere between 2 to 4 hours max, which might seem like it should be a negative, but honestly it's the perfect length for this game, mainly because the game's controls can probably drive you a little bit bonkers at points. They're definitely pretty solid overall, but they definitely have moments where they're a little too floaty. Another issue is there's just not a lot of variety when it comes to the overall game design. For the most part, you're running either left or right, maybe dodging a few enemies, or attacking a couple of them, making it a pretty simple game. This doesn't make it a bad experience overall, it's just a product of its time. We do get the ability to climb walls, which, although interesting, is very limited since you only have certain areas where it's actually viable, and you also have a very limited amount of wall running that you can do, due to a stamina meter. If I did have to level any real complaints at the game, I would say that it doesn't really do a good job of showing you what's ahead. And by that, I mean you're probably going to get your fair share of unwanted deaths, and you're going to die a lot in this game. Now, it's not like the game is extremely hard by any means, and you're not going to be making a ton of leaps of faith. However, thanks to the combination of the slightly floaty controls, the wall running ability, and the fact the camera is just a little bit too zoomed in, you're going to have a hard time stopping before you fall down into a pit. This won't really happen until the late game, or at least that was the case for me. However, it did happen, and it did drive me a little loony. It's a good joke, I promise. Overall, even though this is a shorter game, it's a pretty cohesive experience, and if you want a little bit of nostalgia, you definitely can't go wrong here. If you're someone who is of our age, and by that I mean old, and you have kids and you want to share something with them from your childhood, this might actually be a great game to show them, because 1, it's very pretty, and 2, it's not overly difficult. Being pretty much my favorite tie-in game from my childhood, Animaniacs released a couple years later, seeing us play as the legendary trio of Wacko, Yakko, and Dot. They're attempting to stop Pinky and the Brain from taking over the world, who have stolen the script to the greatest movie ever made. In what was already a very fourth wall breaking show, it's translated into this game pretty damn well, as we see the trio make their way around the Warner Bros. Film studio collecting the pages of said script. Instead of being a straight 2D platformer though, like Tiny Toons, Animaniacs sees us in more of a 2.5D style of platforming. Controlling somewhat closer to a beat 'em up of the time, it sought to change the formula of what we would have expected, at least from this gameplay perspective. Although I wouldn't outright say the control is the best I've ever played, but it's very serviceable. It is somewhat flawed, but once you understand what the game wants from the player, it's not too bad. Basically, you can go back and forth no worries. However, when it comes to going up and down, closer or further away from the screen, that's where it can become a little bit more tricky, because unlike beat-em-ups like Streets of Rage where you can move freely over the screen, Animaniacs works more in a lane system when it comes to its vertical axis. Now, depending on what level you're in, it could be 3 or 4 lanes, meaning you need to press up and down on the controller once in order to change lanes respectively. Once you get the hang of it, the control becomes way less of an issue, but you will from time to time fall off and fail, which can be a little frustrating to say the least. Like Tiny Toons, the game sees each level almost play as its own little episode in a sense, typically being a parody of all-time classic movies. On a presentation level, I can barely fault anything again. I find the character sprites to be pretty much spot on, and it feels like a perfect depiction of the chaotic trio. But it's more than just them, from Pinky to Ralph, Thaddeus Plots to the nurse. Everyone looks incredible. The bright colours and big sprites make it an absolute joy to look at. However, it does have one thing that makes it a little too busy for my liking, and that's the slot machine that runs at the bottom of the screen. Typically, this does give you special rewards as you collect coins throughout the levels, but I could find myself getting a little distracted by it at times, especially when it would make sounds when you failed. It's not going to ruin the experience by any means, but I think the game would have done better to just have a shop level that you could go to instead. However, also like Tiny Toons, this game will have you losing lives a bit more than you would expect. It's far from easy. However, you do get to play as the trio, as I mentioned, so you do get to take a couple of hits before you fail. But if you do lose members to Ralph, you will need to go through a mini level climbing back up the Warner Bros. Water tower in order to save them. The water tower itself is not a particularly hard level. It plays a lot more vertical compared to the traditional horizontal, and it's a nice change of pace. However, with this said, it does get very repetitive since it is always the same. This does make it pretty easy, however, it does get a little bit boring. Well, at least it did for me, and that's because I am absolutely terrible at platformers, as I like to make abundantly clear, because it meant I had to do this quite a lot. If you fall or fail while trying to save everyone, it's not too bad because you can just try again, there's no real punishment. However, you do end up wasting some of your own personal time, which I could argue is the biggest punishment of all. It feels like a bit of padding to the game in order to make it feel a bit more substantial than what it is. Because like Tiny Toons, this is another game you could beat in a couple hours or less if you know what you're doing. Overall though, I think this is a game that has aged pretty well, at least for me. I love it as much now as I did when I was a kid, and I couldn't ask for much more in an Animaniacs game. Even though it is short, it doesn't overstay its welcome, and that's pretty damn good. I would still start off with Tiny Toons if I was to introduce kids to this era of gaming, but if they do manage to beat Tiny Toons and they're looking for something maybe a little bit different, this is definitely one to show them. Departing from the platformers, we move into the last game on the list today, Tas-mania. It follows the walking tornado Taz on his quest to eat as much food as possible. I have to give it to him, it's certainly something different when it comes to a plot of a game, and I appreciate that. Moving to more of a racing game style in the vein of something like Outrun, Tas-mania is arguably the most surprising, considering it could have just played it safe and been another platformer. However, with that said, I wouldn't say it's for the best, because basically we find ourselves playing as Taz running around a track, attempting to eat what I am assuming are kiwi birds, while dodging obstacles and trying to beat the time limit. Now, it's a very simple gameplay loop, and that's all it ever is. I never found that it progressed beyond this, at least as far as I could get in the game. Sure, you get more hazards to avoid, but basically the game never evolves, and it gets pretty old pretty quick. I usually try to be positive when it comes to games, but I found the gameplay structure to be pretty boring and disappointing considering the chaos Taz could have had in his game. Instead, we got a bad interpretation of Outrun where you have to eat some birds. The controls are easily the biggest issue for Taz, because he'll either be way too responsive to the point he's all over the place, crashing into everything, or so unresponsive that there's no way to avoid any upcoming obstacles, and it leads to a lot of frustration. It's not what I would consider a game to be overly hard by any means, but it's far from what I would consider a good overall experience. The game's visual is about the only real plus for me here, as even though I wouldn't say they've aged incredibly well, the Mode 7 effect is done pretty solidly. The sprite and animation work on Taz himself is super good, but visually the backgrounds are very bland, and I do understand, given the use of Mode 7, there's only so much you could expect from a Super Nintendo, but it does kind of get a little bit boring to look at. At the end of the day, it does do what it needs to do visually, and it's not offensive to my eyes, but it would have been nice if it was just a little bit better. I will say that the music is easily the worst of the three games today, and even though this game came out on Super Nintendo between the previous two games in 1993, I feel like they didn't bother to try and add anything new when porting it from the Mega Drive or Master System. It's very simplistic when it comes to the actual OST design, and it gets really old really quick. What really frustrates me with this game is it scored pretty damn high with critics compared to that of the Animaniacs game, and I would play Animaniacs 100 times out of 100 over Taz here. In an odd way though, it does make me glad to do these videos because it allows me to go back to some of my childhood games and revisit them and see if they're actually as good as we thought they were at the time, because sometimes it's just not the case. So with that, lads, ladies, gents, ladetts, whoever, whatever, it brings us to the end of another video. I hope you enjoyed this slightly different format of our retrospectives, as it was just a better way of doing this instead of having a 3-minute long video about going to the left or right and hitting the jump button. What is your favourite cartoon show from this era? I would say mine is probably Pinky and the Brain. If you enjoyed the video, please consider hitting that like button. If you want to go that extra step, you can hit the subscribe button. And if you want to go that extra mile, you can support me on Ko-fi, Patreon, or YouTube memberships like these lovely people here. And with that, I'll see you guys in the next one. Stay safe out there. Bye.